Hey guys, tonight we settle into something that feels both eerie and oddly practical. The times when weddings were actually held at funerals. You probably won't survive this idea at first because your brain will do a double take, but yes, people once thought it made sense to tie the knot right, as others were saying goodbye to the dead. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and the local time. It's always fascinating to see the little constellation of places where we're all tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start with the image of a long wooden table, heavy with food. The scent of roasted meats, dense loaves of bread, and spiced ale lingers in the air. This isn't just a feast for mourners, it's also a celebration of beginnings. Across from the grieving family sits a nervous young couple, ready to exchange vows in the shadow of the departed. That juxtaposition of sorrow and joy feels jarring to you now, but in the past it could seem natural. After all, everyone was already gathered, the food was prepared, and the church or village square was full. Why not make practical use of the occasion? Mainstream historians often note that funeral feasts have been around since antiquity. The Romans, for example, would hold elaborate meals after a burial, a tradition later adopted and reshaped in medieval Europe. And yet, some quirky tidbits survive in folk records. In certain regions, families would literally bake funeral wedding bread, a loaf served both to mourners and to honor a new marriage. You can almost imagine the confusion of flavors, tears in one corner of the hall, laughter in another. Historians still argue whether these combinations were widespread or rare oddities. Some say the practice was mostly economic, a thrifty choice by communities that couldn't afford to throw two feasts. Others argue it carried symbolic meaning, that the beginning of one life together was a counterweight to the ending of another's journey. You might roll your eyes and think, that sounds like an excuse cooked up by someone who didn't want to pay for two pigs to be roasted. Picture the scene in a medieval village, a coffin carried out of the church, followed by townsfolk dressed in their best but somber clothes. Then a few hours later, the same group lingers in the hall, wiping their mouths after a hearty stew. Instead of going home early, they stay for a different announcement, the marriage of a son, daughter, or even a widow. The overlaps save time, effort, and coin. And, honestly, life in the Middle Ages was short and uncertain. Why delay happiness when tomorrow wasn't guaranteed? That idea alone might make you think twice the next time you postpone sending a text to someone you care about. Of course, this blending wasn't without tension. Priests often grumbled in records that such pairings blurred the sacred lines. A funeral was supposed to be solemn, a wedding joyful. To jam them together felt disrespectful. But villagers rarely cared much for clerical frowns when their stomachs were full and their pockets light. And you know how human nature works. Once there's food and drink, people are more willing to tolerate bending the rules. One odd fringe detail pops up in German chronicles. There were tales of brides being led directly from the graveside into the church nave to say their vows. Whether that literally happened or not is debated, but the image of a bridal veil fluttering in the same wind that carried incense smoke from a coffin is one of those weirdly poetic snapshots that history throws at you. It's like someone invented a Gothic novel centuries too early. And you can feel the economy behind it all. Grain was scarce, livestock precious, ale expensive. Throwing two massive gatherings in one season could wreck a family's fortunes. So when an elder died and relatives gathered from afar, it was an opportunity, a grim one, yes, but still an opportunity to celebrate something new. It wasn't about disrespect, but about survival, practicality, and community rhythm. In villages where people rarely traveled more than a few miles from home, bringing everyone together twice was nearly impossible. Imagine yourself as a guest. You sip warm ale, wiping your eyes from grief, only to hear the announcement that a wedding will follow. Do you clap politely, confused about which emotion to lean into? Or do you just go for another slice of bread and accept that life is messy like that? Sometimes you're at a party where death and marriage dance awkwardly in the same room. And so, as you settle deeper into tonight's journey, you realize that these beginnings, these feasts shared by mourners and lovers alike, were not anomalies, but reflections of how communities balanced sorrow with survival. A funeral feast could become a wedding banquet in the very same breath, reminding you that human rituals are never quite as tidy as you'd expect. You drift next into ancient Rome, where public and private life were already intertwined in ways that make your modern calendar look tame. Picture yourself walking along a cobblestone street as incense smoke curls up from a domus, the family house where both mourning and merriment might take place. Roman funerals weren't quiet affairs. They were processions, noisy, theatrical, sometimes even competitive, as wealthy families tried to outdo one another with musicians, mourners for hire, and long parades that clogged the streets. Now imagine that same parade leading into a courtyard feast. Platters of roasted dormice, baskets of figs, and amphorae of wine are carried in, ready to be consumed by friends, clients, and neighbors. On the surface, it's a farewell meal for the deceased. But tucked into the rhythm of Roman life was another reality. A family might seize the chance to settle business, arrange alliances, or, yes, celebrate a wedding. The presence of extended kin, political allies, and community members meant it was as good a moment as any to finalize a union. One mainstream historical fact that survives in Roman law texts is that funerals and weddings both involve banquets sanctioned by custom. Feasting wasn't optional, it was part of how you displayed piety and respect. To skip it was shameful, and if you've ever seen how your aunt insists on a buffet at every family event, you already sense how hard it would have been to avoid. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some Roman epitaphs hint at odd overlaps, where tomb inscriptions mention not only the honored dead, but also the marriages of surviving relatives. It's like someone carved into stone. Here lies Marcus. Also, by the way, congrats to Julia and Gaius for tying the knot. You can almost hear the marble sighing under the weight of multitasking. Historians still argue whether such overlaps were deliberate or accidental. Some claim these were merely coincidences in family records, not literal funeral weddings. Others argue that Romans, being intensely pragmatic, would have had no problem mixing business with ritual. And Roman society was deeply transactional. Marriages weren't love stories as much as contracts binding families together. If a patriarch had just died, transferring loyalty and property through a new marriage might feel not only logical, but necessary. Walk with me into a Roman triclinium, the dining hall. Low couches line the walls, and guests recline as servants pour wine into bronze cups. A grieving son raises a toast for his father's passing, while on the other side of the room, whispers circulate. Tomorrow, his sister will marry into another household. People nod, not scandalized, but comforted that continuity is assured. The dead man's legacy won't dissolve. It flows directly into new bonds. Of course, not everyone approved. Stoic philosophers grumbled about excess, about how Romans turned everything into an excuse for indulgence. Seneca, in particular, complained that people couldn't even mourn without overfeeding themselves. You might laugh at the image, a man trying to give a solemn speech while his neighbour crunches loudly on a honeyed nut. And then there's the macabre humour of it all. Romans were famous for their reminders of mortality. The phrase memento mori, remember that you must die, was whispered in triumphal parades and painted on mosaics. To them, Pairing death and marriage wasn't shocking, it was natural. Life's opposites sat side by side, as ordinary as sandals on your feet. You may pause here and realize, in a society where average life expectancy hovered around 30, waiting too long to marry wasn't an option. Delays risked leaving families vulnerable. So if Uncle Publius just died and the whole clan was in town, why not marry off a daughter? You'd save on travel, lodging, and catering, and Romans loved efficiency almost as much as aqueducts. Still, some fringe records suggest darker associations. There were tales of unlucky unions, couples cursed because they wedded too close to a burial. The belief was that the shadow of death clung to them, dooming fertility or happiness. Whether people believed it universally or not, you can imagine the tension. One guest cheers the bride, another mutters under their breath that she's inviting disaster. And so you walk out of that Roman house, the sound of lyres mixing with sobs, the taste of wine lingering as you wonder, was this a community failing to keep sacred things apart, or was it a culture that accepted life and death as neighbors? Maybe both, and maybe that's the lesson. Human rituals never fit neat boxes. They spill into each other, just like tears spilling into a toast. You find yourself now standing in a medieval churchyard, the air thick with incense, damp earth, and the muffled sound of chanting drifting through stone walls. A burial has just ended, and mourners shuffle slowly out of the church, their shoes crunching against gravel. But instead of dispersing into the village, many stay behind, gathering in clusters near gravestones. The church bell tolls once more, not for the departed, but to summon attention for something startlingly different. A wedding. Medieval Europe was a place where churchyards were more than quiet resting places. They were also bustling social spaces. Markets often took place outside their gates, deals were struck beneath their arches, and in some towns fairs and festivals sprawled across consecrated ground. So it wasn't completely unthinkable that vows might be whispered there too. You can almost see it, one family dressed in black for mourning, another in brighter hues, all converging in the same holy space. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Church records show that marriages frequently happened in or around the church porch, not inside at the altar. The porch symbolized the threshold between secular and sacred life. So if people were already assembled in the churchyard for a funeral, it wasn't a huge leap to shift slightly to the porch and conduct a wedding. It was a matter of proximity, not necessarily disrespect. And then the quirky tidbit. Some chronicles tell of vows spoken practically in earshot of freshly dug graves. Picture a bride stepping carefully around muddy ground, her gown brushing the corner of a tombstone, while a priest mutters blessings meant to both commend a soul to heaven and bind two living ones together. It feels like the setup to a Gothic novel, except it was a village reality. Historians still argue whether these graveyard weddings were common or simply rare curiosities. Some dismiss them as exaggerations from moralists who love to complain about the decline of public virtue. Others think they were simply practical. The same priest was there, the community was gathered, so why not kill, pardon the phrase, two birds with one stone? You walk through that churchyard in your mind, and you can hear both laughter and sobbing weaving together in a strange harmony. The contrast is unsettling. Imagine standing with a tankard of ale, one moment toasting a cousin's marriage, the next moment watching pallbearers shovel earth onto a coffin. It's a roller coaster of emotions packed into a single afternoon. Some clergy bristled at this. They argued that death should not mingle with life so directly. A few even wrote treatises condemning the blending of rituals. But ordinary people, pressed by poverty and distance, probably shrugged. In an era when travel was dangerous and expensive, you didn't miss the chance to gather everyone twice if once would suffice. You might chuckle at one anecdote passed down in English village lore. A wedding feast was so hurriedly paired with a funeral that the same bread loaves were blessed twice. One villager reportedly muttered, "The bread doesn't know if it's for the dead or the wed." It's the sort of line you'd expect to see on a sarcastic medieval Twitter feed, if such a thing had existed. And there's something deeply symbolic about the pairing too. A funeral marked the end of one earthly journey. A wedding marked the beginning of another. In the churchyard, beneath the looming shadow of stone crosses and carved angels, people might have found comfort in that symmetry. It was a way of saying, life continues, love persists, even as we bury one of our own. Of course, danger lurked in superstition. Some villagers whispered that a wedding too close to a grave risked binding the living couple to the dead, creating unhappy unions or barren marriages. The irony, though, is that others believed the opposite, that a wedding blessed by the nearness of a soul's passing was doubly sacred, like a benediction drawn from both heaven and earth. So you wander past those gravestones, listening to the clash of belief, necessity, and tradition. You see brides smiling nervously, grooms gripping their hands too tightly, and priests furrowing their brows at the strange collision of rituals. And you understand, medieval life wasn't tidy. It was raw, improvised, and relentlessly practical. In churchyards where mourning blurred with joy, you glimpse humanity's eternal attempt to reconcile endings with beginnings. You slip now into the rhythm of practicality, the simple math of life and death that made funeral weddings seem less scandalous than they do to your ears today. Picture yourself in a dim medieval hall where candles sputter and the smell of roasted pork mingles with the faint, smoky scent of tallow. Wooden benches creak under the weight of villagers who've come for one reason, mourning, but stay for another, a wedding feast. At the heart of this choice lies money, or rather the lack of it. Throwing a funeral was expensive. Hiring priests, paying for candles, baking bread, and brewing ale, it all drained the family's resources, and weddings carried the same burden, often more. Dowries had to be arranged, feast days declared, livestock slaughtered, musicians hired. For many families, hosting 2 events in close succession was simply impossible. So when death and marriage collided in the family calendar, the practical answer was combine them. One mainstream historical fact stands out from parish account books. Records sometimes show the same family paying once for a massive quantity of food and drink, with no explanation of whether the expense was tied to a funeral or a wedding. The likelihood? It was both. Efficiency wasn't a modern invention, it was survival. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some towns developed what was jokingly called the economy loaf, a single, giant round of bread divided among mourners and then re-blessed by a priest for the wedding crowd. Imagine taking a bite of your slice, not sure whether you're honoring a soul or blessing a couple. And no, you didn't get a discount on calories. Historians still argue whether families merged ceremonies out of true financial desperation or whether it also carried a symbolic weight. Was it really about saving coin, or did it also show off clever thriftiness to neighbours? After all, in tightly bound communities, reputation mattered. If you could host one unforgettable event that honoured both endings and beginnings, maybe people whispered about your prudence rather than your poverty. Now think of yourself as the father of a bride in a village where your brother has just died. You've already borrowed money to provide candles for the burial. The whole town is present, dressed, and gathered in one space. Would you dare delay your daughter's marriage and risk paying twice for everything? Or would you whisper to the priest, "While you're here, Father, we've got another matter to bless"? Practicality pushes harder than propriety. The church wasn't always amused. Records from bishops' courts include complaints against families accused of turning funerals into occasions of excess, meaning too much food, too much laughter, too much wine. Priests feared that solemnity was drowned by merriment. And yet the practice persisted, because once the ale keg was tapped, nobody wanted to waste it. Picture the feast hall again. Platters of roasted goose are passed down long tables. Mourners wipe their tears, then moments later laugh at a bawdy song sung in honor of a new couple. The boundary between grief and joy melts in the candlelight. You sip warm cider and think, humans are endlessly resourceful, even if it means bending sacred customs. In some parts of Europe, it was even a mark of honor to manage both events with flair. A family that could blend mourning with celebration without appearing disrespectful earned a reputation for balance and competence. In other words, you weren't just thrifty, you were admired for pulling off a kind of ritual multitasking. And yet lingering doubts always remained. Some guests muttered that the couple might be cursed, carrying the shadow of death into their union. Others claimed the opposite, that beginning a marriage in the face of death made it stronger, as if defying mortality itself. Both views reveal a culture caught between fear and practicality. So as you sit at that table, your hands sticky from honey cakes shared by mourners and lovers alike, you realize something universal. Human life has always been shaped by the limits of money, time, and circumstance. Sometimes, the most shocking rituals are not born of scandal, but of sheer necessity. And in that necessity, you glimpse the raw, unpolished reality of history. People making do, stretching what little they had, and refusing to let either grief or joy be wasted. You wander into the cadence of village life, where the rhythm of survival dictated nearly every choice, even the timing of weddings. Imagine yourself in a small medieval settlement, the air filled with the smell of tilled soil and damp straw. People rise at dawn, work until dusk, and collapse into bed with little thought for leisure. In such a life, scheduling wasn't about preference, but about necessity. If a funeral pulled the whole community together, then it was natural to tuck another event, like a wedding, into that same gathering. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In much of rural Europe, weddings were rarely private affairs. They were communal obligations. Everyone in the village expected to be fed and entertained, even if they barely knew the bride and groom. This meant the logistics were massive. A cow might be slaughtered, barrels of ale tapped, loaves baked for days in advance. You didn't casually pull that off twice in the same season. So when a funeral already brought the community together, it solved the problem of timing. And now the quirky tidbit. Some village bylaws even specified which days were acceptable for weddings, often tied to religious festivals or market schedules. This meant opportunities were limited. If a funeral happened to land near one of those sanctioned days, the overlap could feel almost preordained. Imagine a priest shrugging and saying, "Well, we're all here, and the feast is already prepared. Shall we proceed?" Historians still argue whether peasants truly embraced this out of joy or resigned themselves to it as the only practical solution. Was it a heartfelt merging of life's milestones, or just a case of, we've got everyone in one place, so let's not waste it? Some scholars lean toward the latter, noting that scarcity shaped nearly every ritual decision. Picture yourself walking into the village square. Chickens scatter as you pass. To one side, women bake bread in clay ovens, their hands white with flour. To another, men dig the grave, wiping sweat from their brows. And right in the middle of this activity, the chatter starts. Since everyone is here, shall we see the young couple wed before the sun sets? No one laughs, no one objects. It's practical, even expected. The emotional whiplash must have been intense. One moment, the air is heavy with grief as pallbearers lower a coffin. The next, fiddlers strike up a tune, children twirl in their rough-spun clothes, and the bride, cheeks flushed, steps shyly into the crowd. You wonder how the villagers reconciled those extremes, but perhaps for them it wasn't an extreme at all. Life and death were neighbours, always brushing shoulders. Priests sometimes pushed back, arguing that such haste cheapened the sanctity of the wedding rite. But in remote places where priests travelled infrequently and villagers dictated their own customs, practicality usually won. Besides, no one wanted to lose half a day's labour trekking back and forth for separate ceremonies. The plough waited for no one. One old folk tale from the Black Forest describes a wedding at which the bride carried both a sprig of rosemary and a strip of funeral cloth from her grandmother's bier. Supposedly it brought blessings from the old to the young. Was it superstition or just symbolic recycling? Hard to say. But it shows how flexible people were in weaving death and marriage into a single tapestry. And perhaps that's the lesson you sense as you drift through this scene. The villagers weren't insensitive. They were attuned to the flow of life in a way modern schedules often hide from you. In their world, grief and joy weren't kept in separate boxes. They were threads of the same fabric, sewn together whenever necessity called for it. So you leave that square, hearing laughter echo against church bells still ringing for the dead, and you realize weddings held at funerals weren't just oddities, they were survival tactics, born from the relentless demands of time, labor, and community life. You step into a dimly lit hall where the air is heavy with tension, not just from mourning, but from the sharp edge of inheritance. A funeral is underway, and beyond the smell of beeswax candles and damp stone, you can feel the unspoken question simmering. Who gets what? Land, dowries, livestock. All were up for redistribution when someone passed away. And sometimes the quickest way to secure those rights was through a marriage performed right there at the funeral itself. One mainstream historical fact is that inheritance disputes were common enough in medieval and early modern Europe to clog up manorial courts. Sons argued with uncles, widows argued with in-laws, and dowries often became points of bitter contention. By marrying at a funeral, a family could shut down rival claims instantly. A daughter promised to one cousin might suddenly be wed to another, cementing his hold on her father's property before the ink on the burial register was even dry. Now for the quirky tidbit. In certain Scottish and Irish traditions, some families staged what they called a bedrite or hearthrite wedding, marrying off a widow or daughter during the funeral wake so the household's legal continuity couldn't be challenged. It was less about romance and more about making sure no opportunistic neighbour tried to move into the empty farmhouse the next morning. Historians still argue whether these stories represent rare acts of desperation or fairly common rural customs. Some claim they were dramatized by later storytellers eager to paint the past as bizarre. Others believe the practice was quite practical in places where written contracts were rare and verbal agreements held sway only if sealed quickly before witnesses. Picture yourself in the middle of such a hall. The coffin rests near the hearth, incense curling upward. A priest recites solemn words and then, almost without pause, he turns to bless a marriage between the widow and the deceased man's younger brother. Gasps ripple through the crowd, but they know the logic. If the widow remarries into the family, the land stays secure. No one outside can swoop in. It's jarring, but it's efficient. You can almost hear the whispered commentary, "Well, she doesn't waste time. Better than losing the sheep to the cousins in the next valley. At least the ale won't go to waste." And you realize that sarcasm has always been a coping mechanism for uncomfortable rituals. The church hierarchy frowned on such quick remarrying, especially for widows. Canon law suggested waiting a decent interval before remarrying, though that interval was rarely defined. But rural families often ignored these rules. survival mattered more than propriety. A widow left unmarried might find herself vulnerable to claims, her children unprotected, her home seized. By remarrying at the funeral, she secured both her safety and her children's inheritance in one stroke. Of course, not every story ended neatly. Some chronicles describe fights breaking out at these double ceremonies, with rival claimants physically pulling brides or grooms away from the altar. You can picture the chaos, one family insisting the daughter must marry their son, another grabbing her hand, shouting about promises made last harvest. The priest sighs, probably wishing he had stuck to quiet baptisms. And yet woven through all this chaos is a clear thread. People were trying to control uncertainty. Death opened doors for rivals to slip in. A wedding slammed those doors shut. The coffin and the altar stood side by side as legal tools as much as spiritual ones. So as you picture the clinking of mugs at the funeral feast, you realize the toasts weren't just for remembrance, they were also for protection. "To the bride and groom," someone shouts. "To keeping the land in the family," another adds with equal fervor. And with that, the mingling of inheritance and marriage feels less like a scandal and more like a cold, pragmatic solution to the problem of survival. You find yourself stepping into a world trembling with fear of plague, where the urgency of survival reshaped every ritual. The year might be 1348, the smell of lime and smoke hangs in the streets, and bells toll endlessly for the dead. In such an atmosphere where bodies piled faster than graves could be dug, the need for continuity pressed heavier than ever. And so, in those years of plague, weddings were sometimes grafted directly onto funerals, not just for convenience, but because tomorrow was not promised. A mainstream historical fact here: during the Black Death, mortality rates in some towns reached staggering levels, up to half the population gone within months. Communities collapsed under the sheer scale of loss. With such devastation, arranging marriages quickly became less about ceremony and more about ensuring lineage. Families wanted heirs, property needed caretakers, and alliances had to be secured before entire bloodlines disappeared. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some Italian city-states, records note couples being married with incense from funerals still burning. The same priest staggering from one ritual to the next, without even pausing to wash his hands. Picture the surreal overlap: funeral torches smoking in one corner, wedding torches being lit in another. It wasn't romance, it was triage. Historians still argue whether these plague weddings were widespread necessity or later exaggerations born of Gothic imagination. Some suggest the accounts are embellished, meant to highlight the chaos of the era. Others point to parish registers where burials and marriages are oddly clustered on the same dates, hinting at real overlaps. You lean toward believing it. It fits too neatly with the brutal pragmatism of plague years. Imagine the scene. A widow has just buried her husband. Within hours, she is betrothed to his cousin. Her veil is still black, her face streaked with tears, and yet the marriage contract is signed. It feels grotesque, but in her world, to wait was to risk destitution, and to refuse was to risk her children being left without protection. You hear the muttered reactions around the hall. Some guests shake their heads, muttering that it is indecent. Others nod grimly, understanding that survival outweighs propriety. And a few, no doubt, whisper superstitions that marrying so close to death invites plague spirits into the new household. But what choice was there? When mortality hovered like a shadow at every door, hesitation was a luxury. In one chronicle from France, there's an almost absurd anecdote. A couple married during a funeral feast reportedly claimed that the smell of death in the air warded off envy from their union. Whether they believed it or simply joked to lighten the mood, it shows the strange ways people tried to rationalize blending two extremes. Picture yourself as a villager. You've just buried your neighbour, and now you stand at the edge of a courtyard where musicians, hired for the funeral, strike up a tune for a wedding dance. You sip watered wine, wondering whether to cry or clap. The rhythm of life has collapsed into itself, mourning and merriment braided so tightly you can't tell them apart. The church, as ever, frowned on the practice. Priests issued sermons warning against unseemly haste, but even they couldn't stop the tide. When half your congregation had already died, moral lectures lost their bite. Priests themselves sometimes encouraged remarriages at funerals, knowing it was the only way to secure stability for vulnerable families. So you leave that plague-stricken town in your imagination, the sound of funeral bells still ringing, overlaid by the laughter of children dancing around a new bride. And you realize, in an age where tomorrow felt as uncertain as a coin toss, people didn't wait for perfect timing. They seized what moments they could, fusing sorrow and joy in one breath, because waiting simply wasn't an option. You linger now in the quiet hush of a candle-lit chapel, where the symbolism of holding weddings at funerals takes on a more profound weight. This wasn't always about money, inheritance, or survival. Sometimes it was about meaning, about weaving life and death into a single ritual tapestry. You sit on a rough wooden bench, the air thick with beeswax and incense, and you watch as a bride and groom clasp hands not long after a coffin has been lowered into the earth. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval and early modern communities saw continuity as sacred. The family line, the flow of generations, was more than economic, it was spiritual. A death created a gap in that line, and a wedding stitched it closed again. In some regions, records even describe deliberate pairing. A patriarch's passing was considered the right moment to plant new roots through marriage. Now for the quirky tidbit. In parts of Scandinavia, there was a belief that marrying at a funeral helped the soul of the deceased transition more peacefully. The joy of new life supposedly cushioned the sorrow of departure. Imagine the odd comfort, believing your grandmother would rest easier in her grave because your cousin finally married his sweetheart by the coffin's side. Historians still argue whether these symbolic readings were deeply held or whether later storytellers romanticized them. Did villagers truly believe they were balancing cosmic scales, or were they simply making the best of awkward timing? The truth is, probably both, depending on who you asked at the table after the service. Picture yourself standing in that courtyard again. The coffin has been lowered, and people wipe their eyes. Then the priest clears his throat and gestures to the young couple. A hush falls. The vows are exchanged in voices trembling with both grief and hope. For the mourners, it feels like a reminder that life marches on, that even as one flame flickers out, another is being lit. The symbolic imagery here almost writes itself. The funeral torches sputter in the evening wind, while wedding torches are carried forward into the darkness. It is as if light itself is passed from one generation to the next. To you, it may feel like an emotional roller coaster. To them, it was continuity. Of course, not everyone welcomed the symbolism. Some moralists warned that blending the two rituals risked confusing sacred boundaries. If life and death were meant to be kept apart, then mixing them was a dangerous violation. Others muttered that it tempted fate. What if the deceased's spirit lingered, envious of the new couple's joy? But others saw it as precisely the opposite, a blessing, a way of showing the community that love outlasts mortality. And there's a kind of poetic symmetry in it, isn't there? Think of the rhythms you see even in nature. One tree falls in a storm, and its space allows sunlight to reach a sapling struggling in the shadows. In the same way, a death created the space for a union. It doesn't make the grief less real, but it layered hope onto sorrow in a way that kept the community steady. As you walk through this moment in your imagination, you notice the softness of it, the bride's veil trembling in the wind, the priest's hands raised, the faint sobs blending with nervous laughter. It's not grotesque, not crude. It's tender. It's humans trying to find meaning where chaos threatened to overwhelm. And so, when you hear the clinking of cups at the feast later that night, you know the toasts aren't only about saving money or keeping property in the family, they are also about balance, about reminding each other that the cycle of life does not pause, even for grief. That in the same hall where death is mourned, love can still be celebrated and the continuity of the community preserved. You move now into the world of clerical disapproval, where the blending of funerals and weddings became a sore spot for church authorities. Picture a weary parish priest, robes rumpled, standing at the front of a crowded nave. He's just finished the solemn words of committal for the dead, only to be nudged by a family insisting he stay a little longer. There's a wedding to perform? His sigh is heavy enough to rattle the candle flames. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval and early modern canon law was very particular about keeping rituals distinct. Each sacrament carried its own liturgy, symbolism, and timing. To combine them was seen as muddling God's order. Bishops issued warnings against improper mixtures of rites, and synods occasionally passed decrees forbidding weddings during mourning. But enforcement was uneven, especially in rural parishes where bishops rarely visited. Now for the quirky tidbit. One 15th century cleric from England complained that villagers were treating churches like inns of convenience, demanding back-to-back services to suit their schedules. His letter reads like a medieval Yelp review. 1 star, too much multitasking, would not officiate again. You can practically hear his exasperation. Historians still argue whether such complaints reveal widespread practice or only isolated annoyances. Were priests genuinely swamped with double bookings, or did a few unusual cases spark outsized outrage? Either way, the fact that clergy wrote about it at all shows it happened often enough to ruffle cassocks. Imagine yourself as a priest trying to keep order. You've just led mourners in solemn hymns, incense still curling toward the rafters. And suddenly a fiddler strikes a string, a bride steps forward in a white linen gown, and the congregation shifts awkwardly from grief to applause. You feel the sanctity of both moments diluted, as if laughter and tears are colliding in ways that dishonor both. But from the villagers' perspective, your disapproval feels remote. They know you'll move on to the next parish tomorrow, but they'll live with the consequences of lost time, extra travel, and wasted food if they separate the ceremonies. So they smile politely at your frown and carry on with their plans anyway. One anecdote from French records tells of a priest storming out mid-feast because villagers turned a wake into a wedding celebration without his blessing. The family shrugged and continued anyway, declaring the vows before the community without clerical sanction. It shows how authority could bend or break when communities valued practicality more than doctrine. And yet, even among priests, there were shades of tolerance. Some quietly allowed double ceremonies, especially if it meant reinforcing stability in their parish. A widow remarried quickly meant fewer disputes, fewer vulnerable children, fewer legal headaches. Pragmatism sometimes outweighed rules, even for the clergy themselves. As you sit with this tension in your mind, you can almost feel the divide. On one side, the church insisting on purity of ritual, on the other, villagers pressing for efficiency and continuity. The clash is as old as organized religion itself, rules versus real life, doctrine versus necessity. So, when you hear the priest's muttering complaints over his wine cup later that night, you understand they aren't just about disrespect, they're about control, about keeping boundaries clear in a world where ordinary people kept blurring them. And once again you see how history is shaped not just by kings and councils, but by stubborn villagers who insisted on living and marrying on their own terms. You wander now into the echoing halls of nobility, where the blending of funerals and weddings took on a very different character. Among peasants, it was often about survival and convenience, but for aristocrats it became about spectacle, grand gestures performed before an audience, sometimes with a touch of theatre that would make Broadway blush. A mainstream historical fact: dynastic marriages in Europe were rarely about love. They were about consolidating power, preserving alliances, and showcasing wealth. When a duke died, his funeral was not just a private mourning, it was a political stage. Nobles gathered from across the region, each dressed in extravagant mourning clothes, each eager to display their status. With so many powerful families in one place, it wasn't unusual to seize the chance to announce a marriage, cementing a new alliance while the ink of the funeral rites was still drying. Now for the quirky tidbit. In the 15th century, there are reports of noble families arranging weddings during the same week as funerals, not simply to save time, but to dazzle rivals. Imagine a hall draped in black banners for mourning, and yet, on the very next day, the same space is hung with gold cloth for a wedding feast. The shock value alone was part of the performance. Sorrow one day, triumph the next, a deliberate reminder that their family's power endured. Historians still argue whether these overlapping ceremonies were common strategy or exceptional drama. Some argue that the idea of funeral weddings among nobles was exaggerated by chroniclers seeking to highlight their extravagance. Others suggest it was shrewd politics, showing that death could not weaken a dynasty if heirs were immediately married and alliances swiftly renewed. Picture yourself at one of these events. A long hall filled with flickering torches. The coffin of a great lord lies at the front, covered with velvet, guarded by armoured retainers. Mourners murmur prayers. Then, scarcely hours later, servants sweep the same floor, replacing black drapes with banners bearing family crests. Musicians rehearse and guests trade their sombre faces for smiles. The same nobles who wipe tears in the morning raise goblets of wine in the evening. The contrast is staggering, yet purposeful. Life moves on, and power does not pause. One anecdote whispered in Burgundian chronicles describes a widow remarried to her late husband's cousin before the funeral candles even guttered out. It sounds indecent, but in context, it was brilliant political theatre. The family signalled, "We are not weakened, our estates are secured." It was a message meant for rivals as much as for God. And of course, gossip buzzed around such occasions like bees at a summer fair. Nobles thrived on scandal as much as peasants did. Whispered commentary might sound like, "Did you see the Countess in white so soon after black?" Or, "The Duke's son seems more eager for land than for vows." You might laugh at the pettiness of it, but those whispers were weapons. Every raised eyebrow was part of the political game. Clergy naturally bristled. Bishops scolded nobles in letters, warning that such blending of sorrow and joy mocked the sacred. Yet nobles were rarely cowed. They knew the church needed their patronage, and besides, who could stop a duchess from turning a wake into a wedding banquet when her household could feed 1,000 guests at once? As you leave that great hall in your imagination, the sound of viols and lutes rising in the air, you realize the double ceremony wasn't just about continuity, it was about performance, about showing strength and wealth in the face of mortality. For nobles, a funeral wedding wasn't scandalous, it was strategic theatre, proof that power lived on no matter who had just been laid in the ground. You step now into the world of whispers, where the mingling of funerals and weddings stirred gossip hotter than the mulled wine served at the feast. Ordinary villagers and nobles alike knew how to turn their tongues sharper than knives, and nothing invited speculation faster than a bride walking down the aisle while funeral candles still smoked. A mainstream historical fact. In early modern Europe, moralists often complained about how quickly widows remarried. Manuals of conduct scolded women for showing unseemly haste, yet records reveal many did so out of necessity. A funeral wedding then became an irresistible target for chatter. Neighbours muttered about indecency, about families who couldn't wait a fortnight before dancing. Gossip wasn't just small talk, it shaped reputations for generations. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some parish registers note peculiar nicknames given to couples who married at funerals. In one English village, a pair wed during a wake were remembered as Ash and Ale. Ash for the funeral ashes, ale for the overflowing drink. The nickname stuck so firmly that later generations barely recalled their real names. Imagine your entire lineage reduced to a sarcastic rhyme. Historians still argue whether this gossip reflected genuine outrage or was simply a form of community entertainment. Was the scorn sincere, or was it the medieval equivalent of tabloid headlines, half disapproving, half thrilled by the scandal? Either way, the effect was lasting. Families known for mixing death with marriage might carry a reputation for being either thrifty geniuses or heartless opportunists, depending on who told the tale. Picture yourself at a village alehouse after one such double ceremony. The men gather with tankards in hand, smirking. "Did you see her veil still damp with tears?" one says. Another replies, "Aye, but better tears than debts. At least the bread was fresh." You sip your drink and feel how quickly disapproval curdles into humour, then into acceptance. By the time the third round is poured, the gossip has become a funny story instead of a scandal. Among nobles, the gossip carried sharper edges. Courtiers thrived on rumour as a political weapon. A marriage performed too soon after a duke's funeral might be painted as evidence of greed or betrayal. Whisper campaigns flourished in palace corridors. The countess didn't mourn at all, she only waited for her husband's death to wear pearls again. Such talk could influence alliances, turning marriages into fodder for intrigue. The clergy, too, added their voices. Preachers thundered from pulpits that couples who wed in the shadow of funerals risked divine punishment. Some even claimed such unions were cursed, destined to produce barren wombs or quarrelsome households. But behind closed doors, those same priests might still enjoy the bread and ale, their protests softened by full bellies. And yet the human side of it lingers. Imagine the bride herself, cheeks flushed with shame as much as joy, overhearing whispers about impropriety. She may have no choice in the matter. Her family decided the timing. The priest merely blessed it. And yet she carries the burden of the gossip for years, her marriage remembered less for love than for its proximity to a coffin. So you leave that alehouse in your imagination, the laughter and whispers still echoing in your ears. You realize gossip was as much a part of the ritual as the prayers themselves, an unavoidable chorus that followed every unusual choice. In funeral weddings, it wasn't just bread and wine being shared. It was stories, rumours and reputations, traded as eagerly as the food passed down the long tables. You drift now into the awkward hush that follows a burial, where widows often found themselves at the centre of unsettlingly swift remarriages. Imagine a woman dressed in black, her eyes red from weeping, standing only steps away from the coffin of her husband. Before the last candle burns out, she is approached by family members, not with condolences, but with an offer or perhaps a command. Marry again right now before the embers of mourning cool. A mainstream historical fact is that widows were in precarious positions across much of history. In medieval and early modern Europe, they were often left without legal control over property. Unless remarried, they risked losing homes, land, or even guardianship of their own children. Marrying quickly, even at the funeral itself, wasn't necessarily a choice of the heart, but of survival. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some communities believe that a widow's tears at a funeral doubled as a kind of holy water for her next marriage. One German folktale suggested her crying over the coffin and then reciting vows immediately after brought fertility luck, as though grief itself could be transformed into blessing. You might tilt your head at that logic, but people clung to whatever superstition eased the discomfort of these rushed unions. Historians still argue whether widows truly embraced this speed or whether they were pressured into it by families eager to secure inheritance lines. Some records show women remarrying within days, even hours, of their husband's death. Were they complicit, practical, or coerced? The debate continues because surviving documents rarely capture the widow's voice, only the outcomes. Picture yourself at such a moment. The coffin lies open in a candlelit room, prayers still murmured by the priest. Suddenly the widow is guided forward, her hand placed into that of her late husband's brother or cousin. The air is thick with unease, but the logic is undeniable. This union keeps the estate intact, the children provided for, the rivals shut out. Guests watch silently, torn between sympathy and judgment, and you hear the whispers, sharp as needles. "Too soon," someone mutters. "Better safe than starving," another replies. The clash of opinions fills the room, but the widow herself stays quiet, eyes downcast, perhaps resigned, perhaps relieved. In a world where women's voices were rarely central, her silence speaks volumes. The clergy frowned on these practices, of course. Canon law urged widows to wait before remarrying. Some texts suggested months, even years. Yet in rural parishes, those rules often dissolved. Priests themselves sometimes officiated quick remarriages at funerals, reasoning that keeping property stable was preferable to letting chaos reign. One curious tale from Irish law tells of a widow who married her husband's younger brother at the graveside itself. Villagers later swore that the groom had to step carefully to avoid tripping on the coffin lid as he said his vows. Whether true or exaggerated, the story reveals how shocking the juxtaposition could appear, even to people accustomed to mingling rituals. And so you picture the scene closing. The widow, now a bride, sits at the feast table, her black veil replaced by a wreath of rosemary. She drinks from the same cup she raised to her husband's memory an hour before. Around her, guests laugh nervously, unsure whether to treat the day as tragedy or celebration. You realize in that moment that history rarely offers clear categories. A widow's quick remarriage at a funeral wasn't only scandalous or only practical, it was both. It was a survival tactic, dressed in sacred words, a reminder that life never paused, even in the shadow of death. You step now into the half-lit realm of folklore, where superstition clung to funeral weddings like ivy around a church wall. For ordinary people, these overlapping ceremonies weren't just practical. They were charged with omens, signs, and whispered warnings. You walk through a village square where a coffin rests on a bier and a bride waits at the church porch, and you hear old women muttering charms under their breath, as if to ward off spirits hovering too close to the vows. A mainstream historical fact is that across Europe, marriage and death rituals both attracted heavy layers of superstition. Bells were rung not only to mark sacred moments, but also to scare away evil forces. Flowers weren't just decorations, they were believed to protect the living from ghosts and ensure fertility. So when a wedding was held at a funeral, people saw it as a collision of two powerful sets of rituals, each with its own taboos. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some Germanic traditions, villagers claimed that if a bride's veil brushed the coffin during a funeral wedding, she would be haunted by the deceased, her nights plagued by cold footsteps and whispers. Yet in parts of rural Italy, the opposite belief held sway. Allowing the bride's veil to graze the coffin was thought to ensure blessings, as if the dead were personally handing luck to the couple. One culture saw doom, another saw protection. Historians still argue whether these beliefs shaped actual practice or were simply stories told afterward to explain unusual unions. Were villagers genuinely convinced of supernatural consequences, or were these just entertaining tales that lent drama to otherwise practical arrangements? The line between folklore and fact is blurry, as it so often is in the study of everyday life. Imagine the atmosphere. A hush falls as vows are spoken near the coffin. Someone drops a cup, and a gasp ripples through the crowd. An omen, perhaps. A raven caws from a nearby tree, and a grandmother clutches her beads tighter. For the villagers, every detail could tip the balance between blessing and curse. The couple themselves might smile nervously, wondering whether joy could survive the heavy presence of death. Priests, of course, tried to stamp out these superstitions. They preached that the sacraments were holy enough without charms and omens. But in the minds of villagers, religion and folklore interwove seamlessly. Lighting a candle to St. Mary and tying a knot of red thread in a bride's gown felt equally necessary. Why risk angering unseen forces when the cost of a mistake could be misery? One ballad from Scandinavia tells of a bride who married at her father's funeral and was believed to carry the shadow of sorrow in her womb, birthing 3 children who each died young. Was it a tragic coincidence or a tale told later to prove that breaking custom led to disaster? Either way, the story lingered in the collective imagination, fueling the sense that funeral weddings were dances with the supernatural. And yet not all was fear. Some villagers believed that such unions symbolized ultimate harmony, the souls of the dead watching over the union of the living, binding generations together. A bride might even carry a sprig of yew, normally planted in graveyards, as part of her bouquet, believing it bridged the gap between life and death. What looks to you like a morbid gesture was to her a charm of strength. As you step away from the churchyard in your imagination, the echoes of those superstitions follow you. Whispers about veils brushing coffins, about ravens as omens, about blessings hidden in sorrow. You realize these beliefs gave shape to the otherwise unbearable contradictions of funeral weddings. They wrapped grief and joy in stories that made sense of the chaos, even if only for a single day. You wander across the patchwork map of Europe, where each region flavored the custom of funeral weddings with its own peculiar habits. It's as though grief and matrimony were ingredients tossed into a pot, and every culture seasoned the stew differently. You begin in Germany, where villagers whispered about omens, then cross into Italy, where feasts leaned more toward exuberance than unease, and finally into England, where parish registers hold curious little notes that hint at double ceremonies. A mainstream historical fact. Marriage customs varied wildly from place to place in medieval and early modern Europe. In England, many weddings were performed in the church porch, a liminal space that also hosted other rites, including farewells for the dead. In Italy, processions spilled into streets, making public spectacle a natural backdrop for blending rituals. And in the German states, tight-knit rural villages leaned heavily on folk traditions, mixing Christian sacraments with older superstitions. So when weddings occurred near funerals, each region gave the practice a slightly different flavor. Here's the quirky tidbit. In Bavaria, there's a 16th century account of a black and white feast, where half the guests dressed in mourning colors while the other half dressed in wedding finery. Picture the scene. One long table, one end draped in black cloth with funeral bread stacked high, the other end bright with garlands and sugared almonds. Guests joked about which end of the bench you chose, determining whether you left in tears or laughter. Historians still argue whether such colorful accounts are exaggerations. Folklorists love embellishment, or whether villagers truly staged such striking contrasts. Was the black and white feast a symbolic ritual, or just a chronicler's flourish meant to make a dull village tale more entertaining. No one can say for certain, but the idea lingers like a vivid painting in your imagination. In Italy, especially in the south, funeral feasts often spilled into wedding banquets almost seamlessly. The shared food, bread, olives, wine, blurred the line between grief and joy. Some regions even coined sayings like, "A death feeds the living," to justify combining the ceremonies. You imagine the clamour of voices in a sunny courtyard, the clink of glasses echoing both sorrow and celebration in the same breath. Cross the channel into England, and you find parish scribes dutifully recording odd pairings. One register from Kent notes, "Buried Thomas Farmer, thereafter was married William and Alice, with guests already present." The bluntness is almost comical, as if the clerk didn't even blink at the absurdity. To him it was just another day's work. And then there's Scotland, where some clans believed it was auspicious for marriages to occur in the presence of ancestors. A funeral provided exactly that, a gathering where the dead were close, in memory and in ritual. To marry at such a moment wasn't disrespectful but profoundly connective, as if asking the departed to bless the new household. As you drift through these regions in your imagination, you notice how the atmosphere shifts. In Germany, superstition hums like a warning note. In Italy, feasting and laughter drowns sorrow in wine. In England, practicality dominates, with clerks shrugging as they jot the odd overlap into ledgers. And in Scotland, spirituality makes the union feel ancestral, not scandalous. The church tried to impose uniformity, but the people resisted. Culture is stubborn, shaped by soil, weather, and old beliefs too deep to uproot. And so funeral weddings became not one single phenomenon, but many local customs stitched together across the quilt of Europe, each square telling its own tale of how humans reconcile life with death. You journey now across the ocean, where settlers carried with them not just seeds and tools, but also old habits, including on occasion the strange blending of funerals and weddings. Picture a colonial outpost in early America, rough-hewn cabins, smoke curling from chimneys, and a meeting house serving as both church and town hall. Life here is precarious, harsh winters, thinning supplies, illnesses sweeping through families. In this fragile environment, practical customs from the old world sometimes took root in new soil, a mainstream historical fact. Early colonial communities often reused European patterns of ritual, but adapted them to the demands of survival. Weddings were public contracts binding families and resources together, while funerals were one of the few moments when scattered settlers gathered in one place. The overlap became tempting, especially when clergy was scarce and travel was dangerous. Here's the quirky tidbit. One New England diary from the 17th century mentions a marriage hastened at a burying, where the minister, already present for the funeral, was persuaded to solemnize a union before he left town. The entry offers no judgment, just a plain note, as though recording the weather. It reads like someone jotting down, "rained today." Also had beans for supper. Oh, and yes, married 2 people at a funeral. Historians still argue whether such practices were regular or merely rare improvisations. Some scholars think Puritan communities would have frowned upon the mingling of joy and sorrow, given their strict emphasis on order and propriety. Others counter that necessity often trumps rules, and colonists were nothing if not pragmatic. With ministers travelling miles between settlements, why not seize the chance to combine rites? Imagine the scene in a colonial meeting house. The coffin rests at the front, the congregation huddled against the cold. After the final prayer, the minister clears his throat, and a young couple steps forward. Guests murmur, some nodding in approval, others pursing lips. The vows are brief, practical, perhaps even rushed. No elaborate feasting, just a shared loaf and a cup of cider. In this setting, the act feels less scandalous and more inevitable. And of course, the gossip still followed. Even in small communities, tongues wagged. Too soon, some whispered, but better done than delayed. Others joked about how the same bread served to mourners doubled for the wedding. Colonial humour was dry, sometimes literally. At least the bread didn't stale before the vows. In the American South, where distances were even greater and clergy scarcer, funeral weddings may have carried another dimension, securing labour and property. A widow marrying quickly after her husband's burial meant the plantation or farm remained stable, avoiding disputes. Local courts sometimes looked the other way, preferring swift order to prolonged uncertainty. Yet among Quaker communities, the blending of ceremonies was almost unheard of. Their emphasis on simplicity and spiritual discernment meant that each rite stood alone. But even here, the broader colonial context reminded them that not everyone followed the same scruples. Diversity of practice was part of the American experiment, even when it meant shocking combinations. As you stand in that meeting house in your imagination, you sense the mixture of necessity, practicality, and faint disapproval. The floor creaks beneath heavy boots, the air smells of pine pitch and wool cloaks, and the minister's voice lingers in your ears. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and now, do you take this man to be your husband? It feels bizarre, yet perfectly suited to a world where every moment mattered, and every ritual had to serve double duty. You leaf now through the dusty pages of court records where the mingling of funerals and weddings didn't just stir gossip, it sometimes sparked lawsuits. Imagine clerks hunched over ink-stained desks, their quills scratching down disputes in cramped Latin or blunt English. Behind each line lies a story of grief, haste, and quarrels over what should have been sacred. A mainstream historical fact. Ecclesiastical and manorial courts across Europe often dealt with disputes about marriage validity. Was the union legal? Was the timing acceptable? Did the vows count if spoken in unusual circumstances? When weddings took place at funerals, such questions became tangled in property rights and family feuds. Records show trials where heirs contested whether a funeral wedding had been properly blessed, arguing that without clear sanction, the marriage, and thus the claim to land, was void. Now for the quirky tidbit, one 17th century record from the Low Countries describes a case where two brothers fought over which of them had truly married their widowed sister-in-law. Both claimed the ceremony happened during their father's funeral, but each insisted the priest had blessed him. The court spent months unraveling contradictory witness accounts, some swearing it was Brother A, others sure it was Brother B. In the end, the judge ruled the marriage invalid altogether, scolding the family for turning a funeral into a carnival of confusion. Historians still argue whether such records reflect common practice or simply rare, dramatic cases preserved because of their oddity. Were funeral weddings so widespread that courts routinely sorted them out? Or do we just hear about the bizarre ones because scribes couldn't resist writing them down? The absence of everyday details leaves room for endless debate. Picture yourself as a villager summoned to testify. You shuffle into the cold hall, hat in hand, and swear on the Bible. The judge asks, "Did you see the widow wed at the bier?" You nod but hesitate. Was it truly a marriage, or just words spoken in haste? Your testimony might shift the balance of an estate, your memory becoming a weapon in someone else's war. In some cases, courts even fined priests for allowing the overlap of rites. A parish record from northern France notes a cleric disciplined for indecorous haste after performing both a burial and a wedding within the same hour. You can almost hear his defense. The family insisted the bread was already baked, but the bishop, unimpressed, docked his pay anyway. And not all disputes were solemn. One English court roll describes neighbours mocking a couple wed at a funeral, dubbing them the coffin bride and grave groom. The insult escalated into a brawl at the tavern, which then landed everyone in court for disturbing the peace. What began as a muddled ritual ended as a legal headache. As you close those dusty ledgers in your mind, you realize the blending of funerals and weddings didn't just stay in whispered gossip or folklore. It entered the cold machinery of law, where human grief and human greed collided on parchment. And though the ink has faded, the tension remains vivid. In the shadow of death, marriage could be both a blessing and a battlefield. You ease now into the softer world of story and song, where the memory of funeral weddings was preserved not only in dusty ledgers, but in the voices of balladeers, poets, and village storytellers. Facts fade quickly, but tales linger, embroidered with details too dramatic to forget. You can almost hear a lute plucking in the background as a singer begins. There once was a bride who wed by the bier. A mainstream historical fact is that folklore and ballads often served as the newspapers of their time, carrying news and moral lessons alike. When something unusual happened, like a marriage at a funeral, it often slipped into song. These tales rarely gave precise dates or names, but they carried the mood of events, shock, scandal, humor, or even admiration. By the time the story reached the next village, it had grown into legend. Here's the quirky tidbit. A 16th century English ballad tells of a maiden wed in mourning cloth, describing her veil as black as night, yet bright with vow. It's a contradictory image, mourning and matrimony stitched together in rhyme. Whether or not the event happened, villagers sang it around hearths in winter, half giggling at the absurdity, half leaning in for the moral. Historians still argue whether these songs are faithful echoes of real practices or simply cautionary tales. Was a bride actually married beside her father's coffin? Or was the ballad a satirical jab at those who rushed into unions? It's impossible to know, but the persistence of such stories across regions hints that they had at least some basis in reality. Imagine yourself sitting in a smoky tavern, listening to a fiddler croon a tune about a widow who remarried before her husband's grave had cooled. Crowd chuckles, claps along, and mutters comments between verses. For them, the song is entertainment, but it's also a reminder. Don't be too hasty, lest your neighbours laugh at you for centuries. In Scandinavia, sagas and folktales sometimes portrayed funeral weddings as signs of fate, love born from sorrow, destiny tying two families together even as death divided them. One tale tells of a warrior who fell in battle, and at his funeral feast his betrothed wed his younger brother to keep the fire burning. The story reads less as scandal and more as heroic continuity, a way of showing that family lines and oaths could never be broken. Elsewhere, legends veered toward the Gothic. A Hungarian tale warned of a bride who married at a wake and was haunted by her first husband's ghost until she begged forgiveness at his grave. You can picture villagers whispering that story on stormy nights, lanterns flickering, as a warning about disrespecting the boundary between death and love. Even literary works picked up the theme. Some Renaissance poets hinted at the paradox, describing the mingling of tears and kisses, of coffins and garlands. The imagery was irresistible, life and death tangled together in a way that spoke to the fragility of existence. So you sit back, listening to the echo of those songs and stories in your imagination. They aren't courtroom documents or parish registers, but they carry a different kind of truth, the emotional reality of how people felt about funeral weddings. Whether laughing, warning, or romanticizing, the tales show that these ceremonies left a mark far deeper than the feasts or contracts themselves. They became part of cultural memory, woven into the lullabies and legends passed from one generation to the next. You drift now into the pamphlet-strewn streets of early modern Europe, where critics and moralists sharpened their quills against the practice of funeral weddings. Imagine walking through a marketplace in London or Amsterdam, where vendors hawk not only bread and fish, but also cheaply printed broadsides. Among them you spot titles dripping with outrage against the blasphemous union of joy and sorrow, or the shame of hasty widows. A mainstream historical fact. With the rise of the printing press in the 16th and 17th centuries, moral commentary spread far more widely than before. Pamphlets attacked everything from fashion to theatre to, yes, unseemly rituals like funeral weddings. These writers positioned themselves as guardians of public virtue, warning that societies blurred sacred boundaries at their peril. Now for the quirky tidbit. One particularly dramatic pamphlet from 1620s England claimed that couples who married during funerals were wed in the devil's shadow. The author even sketched a woodcut of a bride with a skull for a bouquet. Hardly subtle propaganda. You can imagine someone paying a penny for the sheet, reading it aloud in the tavern, and everyone roaring with laughter while still nodding along to the warning. Historians still argue whether such pamphlets reflected genuine moral panic or were simply another way for preachers and printers to profit off scandal. Was the outrage sincere, or was it theatre on the page, shock designed to sell copies? Either way, the very existence of these tracts shows that the custom struck a nerve. Picture yourself flipping through one of these broadsides. The ink smears on your fingers, the language drips with condemnation. Those who wed where corpses lie bring pestilence to their children and grief to their days. Heavy words for what, in many villages, was just a practical solution to scheduling. Yet such rhetoric shaped public opinion, especially among elites eager to distinguish themselves from rustic traditions. Clergy, too, used the pulpit as a printing press of the spoken word. Sermons thundered against the blending of death and marriage. Parishioners were warned that such haste dishonoured both sacraments, robbing funerals of solemnity and weddings of joy. Yet even as they thundered, they often knew that their congregations nodded politely on Sunday, then carried on as usual the next time necessity demanded it. Still, the critiques left their mark. By the 18th century, you see fewer casual mentions of funeral weddings in parish records. Respectability culture was tightening, and pamphleteers had played their role in reshaping what people considered proper. Yet the memory of those unions lingered as a symbol of rural stubbornness, a reminder of how ordinary people lived outside the bounds of official morality. Imagine standing at a stall in the market, the pamphlet in your hand. You chuckle at the exaggerated threats, infertile marriages, haunted households, cursed children, but you also feel the sting of judgment. If you were part of a family who had chosen such a path, you'd know that gossip and pamphlets alike could brand you for years. And so as you close that imagined pamphlet, you realize funeral weddings weren't only contested in fields and feasts, they were fought in print and pulpit, in satire and scorn. And while villagers might laugh off the pamphleteers, their words carried long echoes, shaping how later generations remembered the practice, not as pragmatic survival, but as scandalous folly. You step now into the hum of everyday economy, where the blending of funerals and weddings wasn't dressed up in symbolism or attacked in pamphlets. It was simply the most sensible use of scarce resources. Picture a small village in 15th century France, where the baker has fired his oven all night to churn out loaves for a funeral feast. The smell of warm bread wafts through the square. The alehouse has tapped fresh barrels, and neighbours gather with stomachs growling. In that moment, someone announces, "Why waste what's here? Let us wed as well." A mainstream historical fact is that for most of history, food wasn't abundant. Hosting a large meal required weeks of preparation, grinding flour, brewing ale, slaughtering animals, preserving meat with salt. Families saved and borrowed for months to fund a proper feast. Since both funerals and weddings demanded such extravagance, combining them was not only convenient, but financially shrewd. Now for the quirky tidbit. In parts of Eastern Europe, villagers joked that a pig slaughtered for a funeral always rose again at a wedding. The saying wasn't meant literally, of course, but it captured the recycling of the same food for two ceremonies. Imagine guests laughing at their sausages, muttering, "First for the dead, then for the wed." A macabre pun, but one that made sense to people who couldn't afford to waste a single cut of meat. Historians still argue whether these choices were driven more by desperation or by a kind of thrifty pride. Did families feel ashamed of doubling up, or did they boast about pulling off two ceremonies with one feast? Some chronicles suggest that in poorer parishes the practice was admired as clever, while wealthier families sneered at it as evidence of poverty. Picture yourself seated at a long wooden table, rough linen spread across it. Bowls of stew steam before you, mugs of ale clink together, and somewhere down the row a fiddler plays a cheerful tune. The morning may have been filled with weeping, but by evening laughter rolls through the hall. Children dart between benches, snagging scraps of meat, while elders remind everyone that life must go on, and that food left uneaten is food wasted. The line between thrift and disrespect was thin. Priests often complained that funerals turned into rowdy feasts, but villagers saw no problem. In their eyes, feeding the living honored the dead. And if a marriage was added into the mix, it meant fewer mouths left unfed tomorrow. You might think of it as medieval meal prep with rituals thrown in for efficiency. One curious anecdote from Italian chronicles describes a family so poor that they used the same garlands of flowers to decorate both coffin and bridal wreath. Guests quipped that the blossoms served twice before they wilted. You might laugh at the dark humour, but it shows how necessity inspired ingenuity. So as you settle into this imagined table, you realize the practice wasn't only about survival, it was also about community. Everyone ate, everyone witnessed, everyone participated. The economy of the feast reflected the economy of the village, nothing wasted, everything shared. It may have scandalized priests and pamphleteers, but for ordinary people, funeral weddings were simply common sense, written into bread, ale, and laughter. You step now into the sensory heart of these blended ceremonies, the food itself. Beyond the politics, gossip, and inheritance battles, it was the bread and drink that tied mourners and newlyweds together. Imagine a long trestle table groaning under the weight of platters, dark loaves dusted with flour, roasted meats glistening with fat, pitchers of ale sweating in the candlelight. Whether you were there to grieve or to cheer, your stomach was filled by the same food, and that alone made the overlap feel strangely natural. A mainstream historical fact. In many parts of Europe, both funerals and weddings required alms bread, loaves baked in bulk, and handed out not just to guests, but to the poor. Bakers sometimes prepared hundreds of small rolls, stamped with crosses or family symbols. At a funeral, the bread was meant to honor the dead. At a wedding, it symbolized prosperity for the couple. When the two ceremonies collided, the bread became doubly symbolic, nourishing mourners and blessing the newlyweds all in one bite. Now for the quirky tidbit. In parts of Wales there was a superstition that crumbs from funeral bread carried into the marriage feast would keep evil spirits from spoiling the couple's fertility. Guests sometimes pocketed bits of bread, sneaking them into the wedding table as talismans. You can almost picture someone muttering, "Don't brush off the crumbs, those are worth more than the roast goose." Historians still argue whether these symbolic foods blurred the boundary between the two rituals, or whether people simply repurposed whatever was at hand. Was it deliberate fusion, or just economic recycling dressed up with meaning? Either way, food became the bridge between death and love. Picture yourself at the table, tearing into a crusty loaf, the taste of warm wheat mixing with the salt of your own tears. The same bread feeds the poor who shuffle in from the churchyard, the relatives who've travelled miles, and the bride who nervously nibbles before her vows. You lift your mug of ale and it's unclear whether the toast is for the departed soul or the new couple, perhaps both. Wine carried its own weight. In Italy and Spain, red wine poured at funeral wakes was later reused at weddings, its colour symbolising both blood and blessing. Some villagers joked that the same cup could carry you into the grave and into a marriage bed. Others insisted it was holy enough to sanctify both occasions. You take a sip and feel how symbols cling to simple things, how liquid in a cup can hold centuries of meaning. One tale from Eastern Europe describes corpse cakes, small buns baked on coffin lids to absorb the spirit of the deceased. Guests ate them as blessings, believing they carried protection. If a wedding followed, the same cakes were offered to the bride and groom, as though the dead were personally bestowing luck. A little unsettling, yes, but also deeply human in its attempt to weave continuity out of sorrow. And so, as you imagine licking honey from your fingers at this feast, you realize the food wasn't secondary, it was central. It carried memory, superstition, and symbolism in every bite. Bread for the dead, bread for the wed, wine for mourning, wine for joy. The table didn't distinguish between ceremonies, and neither did the guests, who left full, consoled, and reminded that life, like food, was meant to be shared, even in the shadow of death. You wander now into the 18th century, when fashions shifted and the blending of funerals with weddings slowly began to fade. Imagine candlelit parlours with powdered wigs, embroidered waistcoats and lace cuffs. Society was reshaping itself, and with it came a new sense of propriety. What once seemed practical or symbolic began to look gauche, even scandalous, in the eyes of elites who prided themselves on refinement. A mainstream historical fact. By the Enlightenment era, rituals became more codified, and politeness was prized as a social virtue. Weddings were increasingly celebrated as distinct, joyous occasions, carefully choreographed to highlight the bride and groom. Funerals, meanwhile, were framed as solemn, dignified events with their own strict decorum. The overlap of the two began to appear less like sensible efficiency and more like a social faux pas. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some 18th century etiquette manuals, writers warned against marrying in the shadow of mourning, claiming it offended taste and sensibility. One particularly snooty pamphlet from Paris even declared that no lady of refinement would permit her nuptials to share bread with the beer. It's hard not to smirk at the haughtiness, as if poor villagers were expected to suddenly develop Versailles-level propriety. Historians still argue whether the decline of funeral weddings was truly widespread or mostly confined to urban centres and elites. Did peasants in remote valleys still combine ceremonies out of necessity, even as cities frowned upon it? Evidence suggests yes. Parish registers from rural Germany and Scotland hint that the practice survived longer in isolated communities, even as polite society tutted. Picture yourself in a genteel drawing room in London. A group of ladies in powdered hair whisper behind fans about a cousin who wed too soon after a funeral. Their voices are low, but the judgment is sharp. Indecent, one hisses. Unfashionable, another agrees. What used to be shrugged off as practical now risked branding a family as tasteless. Meanwhile, in rural villages, the gap between high society's disapproval and common folks' pragmatism grew. A farmer's daughter might still marry at her uncle's funeral, not out of disrespect, but because the priest only came to town once a month, her neighbours might nod approvingly, but if word spread to the manor house, it would spark whispers of impropriety, and yet you notice that the symbolism never fully disappeared. Even as fashions changed, the idea that life must replace death lingered in quieter forms. Some families held engagements during periods of mourning, postponing the wedding but still signalling continuity. Others shared funeral feasts that became informal betrothal celebrations, hinting at the older custom without openly practicing it. As you step back from this imagined 18th century world, you sense the shift clearly. The funeral wedding was no longer admired as efficient or symbolic. It had become unfashionable, a relic of rougher times. But beneath the powder and polish, you know the old instincts remained: practicality, community, and continuity. They just hid beneath layers of lace, waiting for historians to notice them centuries later. You step now into the Victorian era, where prudery and propriety settled over society like a heavy lace curtain. Imagine stiff collars, sombre black crepe, and households that measured grief not in days but in carefully timed intervals of mourning. In such a world, the very idea of mixing weddings with funerals became shocking, almost grotesque, a scandal whispered behind gloved hands. A mainstream historical fact, Queen Victoria herself set the tone after Prince Albert's death in 1861. She wore mourning clothes for the rest of her life, a full 40 years, and her devotion to ritualized grief shaped an entire culture. Middle and upper-class Victorians embraced elaborate mourning practices, black veils, strict timetables before one could wear colours again, and unspoken rules about when remarriage was respectable. Against this backdrop, a wedding during or immediately after a funeral seemed almost obscene. Now for the quirky tidbit. Etiquette books of the late 19th century included charts showing precisely how long widows, widowers, and even distant cousins were expected to mourn before re-entering society. A widow marrying at her husband's funeral would not just break the rules, she would shatter them with the force of scandal. You can picture some tight-lipped matron in 1880s Boston declaring why even the family cat should wear black longer than that. Historians still argue whether the Victorian rejection of funeral weddings was complete, or whether rural communities carried on quietly with older practices. Evidence suggests the latter. While urban elites embraced strict mourning, parish records from isolated villages occasionally still show marriages performed during periods of grief. It seems the prudery spread more effectively in drawing rooms than in farmhouses. Imagine yourself at a Victorian parlour, heavy drapes pulled tight, mirrors shrouded in black cloth to prevent the dead from lingering. The smell of lilies fills the air, mingling with candle wax. Guests speak in whispers, careful not to break the solemn mood. Now try to picture a bride stepping forward in white silk to take her vows. The contrast is so stark it feels like a parody. No wonder Victorians recoiled. And yet hypocrisy lurked beneath the surface. Widowers, especially wealthy ones, often remarried quickly, sometimes within months. Newspapers might note it politely, framing it as practical. Widows, by contrast, were judged mercilessly for even considering such speed. The double standard kept gossip mills grinding, with funeral weddings turned into juicy scandals rather than pragmatic solutions. In literature, the practice was occasionally mocked as Gothic exaggeration. Novelists hinted at brides marrying in shadowed halls, haunted by the scent of death. Short stories in penny dreadfuls leaned into the imagery, playing up the eerie blend of veils, coffins, and vows. Even if rare in reality, the idea of a funeral wedding fit the Victorian love for melodrama. As you leave this imagined parlour, you hear the rustle of mourning gowns and the clink of teacups in saucers. The Victorians may have rejected funeral weddings as improper, but by turning them into scandal and fiction, they ensured the memory lingered. What had once been a matter of thrift or survival became in their world a symbol of moral collapse, proof that not all customs could survive the weight of propriety. You wander now into the realm of literature, where funeral weddings found a second life as powerful imagery. Even as the practice faded in polite society, poets and novelists could not resist the dramatic contrast. Love pledged in the shadow of death, joy stitched awkwardly to grief. It was too vivid to ignore, too ripe for metaphor. A mainstream historical fact. The 19th century saw a surge of interest in Gothic literature, a genre obsessed with cemeteries, crypts, and the uncanny overlap between life and death. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe or the Bronte sisters thrived on imagery that blurred joy with dread. Though they did not always describe literal funeral weddings, the motif of veils, coffins, and vows intertwined appeared repeatedly in Gothic novels and poems, echoing the scandalous custom. Now for the quirky tidbit. One minor Victorian poet, Louisa Gray, penned a melodramatic piece titled The Bridal Shroud, in which a bride literally dons her mourning clothes as a wedding gown. The verses drip with imagery of black lace and lilies wilting beside the altar. Critics mocked it at the time as overwrought, but the poem became popular among readers precisely because of its morbid thrill. Historians still argue whether such literature reflected actual customs or merely exaggerated them for effect. Did Gothic writers draw on real remnants of the practice, or did they resurrect it as an imaginative flourish to shock readers? Some scholars insist the Gothic fascination came from real whispers of rural traditions, while others claim it was purely artistic license. The debate, fittingly, mirrors the blurred line between fact and fiction. Imagine yourself leafing through a penny, dreadful, in a dim, gaslit room. The story inside tells of a nobleman's daughter, wed at her father's funeral, her vows interrupted by a ghostly knock on the coffin lid. You shiver, but also smile. It's absurd, yet irresistible. Such tales gave readers the thrill of scandal without the discomfort of witnessing it in reality. Even mainstream literature toyed with the idea. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, though not a literal funeral wedding, the swift marriage of Gertrude to Claudius, after King Hamlet's death, scandalizes the court. The overlap of mourning and matrimony outraged audiences then as much as it does now, proof that the tension between grief and union has long been a fertile ground for storytelling. And beyond the Gothic, satirical writers mocked the practice too. Cartoons in Victorian magazines sometimes depicted comically confused guests, one side of the hall sobbing into handkerchiefs, the other side tossing flower petals. The joke was clear. Society found the idea both unthinkable and yet oddly entertaining. As you close the pages of that imaginary book, you realize literature did what history often fails to, capture the emotional charge. Whether in Gothic terror, poetic lament, or satirical jest, the blending of funerals and weddings became a symbol larger than the events themselves. Even after the practice waned in real life, its echo lived on in ink, feeding imaginations that craved the dramatic dance between love and death. You wander into the quiet corners of rural Europe in the 19th century, long after urban elites had declared funeral weddings scandalous. Out in mountain villages, wind-swept islands, and farming hamlets tucked into valleys, the practice stubbornly survived. Life here wasn't dictated by etiquette manuals or city fashions. It was ruled by seasons, harvests, and the scarcity of priests. A mainstream historical fact. In many rural areas, clergy were itinerant, visiting only once every few weeks or even months. Baptisms, weddings, and funerals piled up, waiting for the priest's arrival. When he came, villagers seized the chance to get everything done at once. A funeral, then, could easily become the occasion for a wedding, simply because no one knew when the priest might return. Now for the quirky tidbit. An ethnographer collecting stories in the Carpathian Mountains in the late 1800s recorded an old woman who remembered her cousin being married while the earth was still loose on the grave. She insisted it wasn't unusual, though she chuckled that the fiddler nearly played a dirge instead of a wedding jig. The line between fact and memory blurred, but the story shows how deeply the custom lingered in oral tradition. Historians still argue whether these survivals were true continuations of medieval habits or simply coincidences born of necessity. Were these communities clinging to an old cultural logic, or were they just improvising when schedules collided? The debate matters less than the reality. Out on the margins, life demanded flexibility. Picture yourself trudging into a highland village where the church is little more than a stone hut, smoke curling from its chimney. The community gathers for a funeral, peat smoke stings your eyes, hymns rise in the cold air. Then, without fanfare, the priest calls forward a young couple. Their vows are spoken quickly, perhaps awkwardly, but no one objects. They all understand, tomorrow the fields need tending, and no one has time to assemble again. Guests carry the memory differently. Some mutter that the couple is cursed to carry sorrow into their marriage. Others declare that the union is doubly blessed, sanctified by both grief and hope. Around the table at the feast, the same bread is broken, the same ale poured. By the end of the night, the lines between mourning and merriment blur, softened by music and drink. Even into the 20th century, folklorists stumbled on echoes of this practice. In isolated parts of Eastern Europe, villagers still told tales of brides wed during wakes, as though the two ceremonies were threads in the same fabric. Whether literal or symbolic, the stories preserved a world-view in which life and death were not opposites, but neighbours sharing the same roof. So as you walk out of that mountain hamlet in your imagination, lanterns glowing faintly against the dark hills, you realize the custom never fully vanished. In quiet corners far from the reach of propriety, funeral weddings lingered like the echo of an older world, half practicality, half poetry, stubbornly alive even as the rest of society tried to bury it. You travel now beyond Europe, stepping into the wider world where similar customs echoed in distant cultures. It turns out the idea of joining death and marriage in one ritual wasn't uniquely European. It appeared in surprising places across Africa and Asia, shaped by local traditions and beliefs. The details shifted, but the theme remained. When communities gathered to mourn, they often took the chance to bind families together as well. A mainstream historical fact. In parts of West Africa, funerals were, and often still are, large social gatherings drawing extended kin from far away. Anthropologists note that these events sometimes doubled as opportunities for arranging marriages. The logic was familiar, everyone was present, food was already prepared, and kinship ties needed renewal in the wake of loss. A bride might be promised or even wed during a funeral week, ensuring continuity. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some Chinese provinces, families occasionally practiced what were called ghost marriages, where a living person was symbolically wed to someone who had just died. The custom was rooted in the belief that the dead needed companionship in the afterlife. While not identical to European funeral weddings, it reveals a shared impulse to weave love, death, and continuity into one ritual tapestry, even if it defied conventional logic. Historians still argue how much these practices were practical responses to circumstance and how much they reflected deeper cosmological beliefs. Were they merely opportunistic, saving resources by combining events, or did they reflect an understanding that life and death were inseparable, two ends of the same cord? The debates continue and the evidence is patchy, but the similarities are striking. Imagine yourself at a funeral in a Nigerian village. Drums thrum into the night, Dancers sway in circles, mourners feast on yam and stew. Amid the celebration of the departed's life, a young couple is called forward. Their vows are shouted above the rhythm of the drums, the crowd erupting in cheers that blur mourning with joy. No one sees contradiction, only continuity. Or step into a courtyard in rural China centuries ago where incense burns beside an ancestral altar. A coffin lies draped in red cloth, and beside it, a living bride bows her head, marrying the deceased. Guests whisper prayers, believing the union secures peace for the dead and stability for the living family. It is unsettling to your modern ears, but to them, it stitched the living and the dead into a single lineage. These global cousins remind you that the impulse wasn't bizarre at all. It was universal. Wherever humans confronted mortality, they sought to bind the wound with continuity, often through marriage. Food, music, vows and coffins mingled across cultures, a reminder that no community could ever keep life and death entirely apart. So as you step away from these far-flung scenes, you realize funeral weddings weren't a quirky European oddity. They were part of a much larger human instinct to insist that where one story ends, another must begin, even if the beginning unfolds in the shadow of grief. You step now into the echoing chambers of reform, where clergy and church councils tried to stamp out the mingling of funerals and weddings once and for all. Imagine a gathering of bishops beneath vaulted ceilings, parchments spread across a long oak table, quills scratching as decrees are drafted. Their words carry both frustration and resignation. Stop this practice. It dishonors the sacraments. A mainstream historical fact. Beginning in the late Middle Ages and intensifying in the early modern period, church authorities issued repeated rulings against blending rituals. Synods across Europe condemned the timing of weddings during periods of mourning, insisting that each sacrament required its own solemn space. Some dioceses even set fines for priests who allowed back-to-back ceremonies. The aim was clear: keep joy and grief from colliding in the same breath. Now for the quirky tidbit. One 17th century decree from a bishop in northern Italy warned priests not to bind hands where death has unbound breath. It's both poetic and petty, a line you can almost hear him rehearsing before writing it down. The very fact that he needed to phrase it so colourfully suggests how often the practice persisted, despite official scolding. Historians still argue how effective these decrees really were. Did they genuinely reshape community behaviour, or were they ignored as soon as villagers left the church doors? The patchy records show both. Some parishes tidied up their rituals to satisfy bishops, while others carried on quietly, confident that local custom outweighed distant authority. Picture yourself in a small church as a nervous priest hesitates. The family urges him to marry a widow and her new suitor during the funeral feast, but he recalls the bishop's threats of fines. His hand trembles over the prayer book. Does he risk punishment by following local expectations, or anger his flock by refusing? The tension is thick enough to feel in your chest. Sometimes priests chose compromise. A marriage might be formally blessed days later, but the vows exchanged informally during the funeral gathering still carried weight in the eyes of the community. Other times the priest yielded outright, knowing that his survival in the parish depended less on obedience to bishops and more on harmony with villagers. Reformers pressed harder during the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation. Both sides, ironically united on this issue, sought to tighten ritual boundaries. They emphasized the dignity of each ceremony and portrayed the mingling of them as a symptom of moral laxity. Yet their very insistence shows how stubbornly the custom survived. As you listen to the imagined rustle of council decrees, you sense the futility of it all. No matter how many rules were inked, people still found ways to merge joy and grief when it suited them. The clergy could frown and fine, but bread would still be baked, ale would still be poured, and couples would still take vows when the whole community was present. And so, leaving that council chamber in your imagination, you realize that funeral weddings lived in the gap between law and life. The church could legislate, but villagers could improvise. And history, as always, belonged not only to the parchment decrees, but also to the stubborn people who carried on in spite of them. You slip now into the hazy borderland between memory and myth, where funeral weddings blurred into folklore, half believed and half exaggerated. Villagers told stories long after the fact, and like all good tales, the details grew taller with each retelling. What began as a pragmatic choice could be reshaped into a scandalous anecdote, a cautionary parable, or even a ghost story told around the hearth. A mainstream historical fact. Oral traditions often preserved memories of local events far longer than written records. Folklorists collecting tales in the 19th and 20th centuries often heard references to the wedding at the wake or the bride of the bier, though the details were vague. These weren't courtroom accounts or parish registers. They were stories passed through generations, transformed into folklore. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some parts of Ireland, villagers spoke of a family so poor they married their daughter during her grandfather's funeral, simply to save the cost of candles. Whether true or not, the tale became a kind of moral joke, half mocking, half admiring their thrift. Children grew up repeating it as though it had happened just a generation earlier, even when no one could recall the actual names involved. Historians still argue whether these tales reflect real incidents, or whether the very idea of a funeral wedding was so outrageous that communities invented stories about them. Was it lived memory or creative gossip hardened into folklore? The debate remains unresolved because evidence blurs between history and legend. Picture yourself in a farmhouse kitchen on a stormy night. The fire crackles, shadows dance on the walls, and an old man leans forward, telling children about the time a bride walked down the aisle in the same hour her uncle was buried. The children gasp, half horrified, half delighted. Whether the story is true doesn't matter. It sticks in their minds as part of local identity. Elsewhere, tales became darker. In Poland, storytellers warned of couples who wed too close to funerals being cursed to argue endlessly, their marriage haunted by restless spirits. A bride who dared to wear flowers from a funeral wreath supposedly doomed her marriage bed to coldness. These stories worked as social control, discouraging people from repeating the practice, even if necessity sometimes still forced it. And yet not all folklore condemned it. In the Balkans, some tales praised couples who wed at funerals as especially blessed, believed to carry the strength of both grief and joy into their lives. One story described a bride who danced with tears still on her cheeks, and the villagers said her household flourished because she honored both life and death in one step. As you drift through these tales, you sense how fluid memory becomes. Funeral weddings may have been rare, practical, or even accidental, but in folklore they became archetypes, thrift, scandal, curse, or blessing depending on who told the tale. The reality is lost, but the echoes remain, reminding you that history is not just what happened, but also what people chose to remember, exaggerate, and pass along. You step now into the hushed lecture halls of modern scholarship, where historians argue across oak tables and conference panels about whether funeral weddings were common practice or rare curiosities. Their debates echo like the tolling of old church bells, steady, repetitive, and never quite conclusive. A mainstream historical fact, written records of funeral weddings are sparse. Parish registers occasionally show marriages and burials recorded on the same day, but they rarely clarify whether the ceremonies were linked. Legal documents sometimes reference disputes over hasty remarriages, but few offer detailed descriptions. This absence of clear evidence leaves scholars torn. Were funeral weddings widespread, or were they just scattered oddities magnified by rumour? Now for the quirky tidbit. One 20th century historian compared the debate to chasing shadows at dusk. He argued that the idea of funeral weddings may have been exaggerated by moralists, folklorists, and later romantics, who all had reasons to dramatize. Yet ironically, the very lack of evidence fuels fascination. Absence becomes as alluring as presence. Historians still argue about interpretation. Social historians emphasize practicality. In poor, rural communities, combining events simply made sense. Cultural historians stress symbolism. Weddings and funerals both marked transitions, so their overlap carried deep meaning. Folklorists insist memory matters more than fact. If people told the stories, then the stories themselves shaped reality, whether or not the events truly happened. Imagine yourself attending a modern academic conference. One scholar presents parish data, insisting funeral weddings were vanishingly rare. Another counters with folklore evidence, arguing they were common enough to enter collective memory. A third raises her hand, suggesting both views miss the point. What matters is how people understood life and death as intertwined. The audience sips bad coffee and nods thoughtfully, as if agreeing and disagreeing all at once. And outside the lecture hall, ordinary people overhear fragments of the debate and smile. To them, the question of how frequent the practice was hardly matters. The mere possibility is compelling, feeding the imagination more than any statistic could. As you leave that scholarly space in your mind, you realize debates about funeral weddings aren't only about the past, they're also about how we read history. Are we looking for hard evidence, or are we listening to the whispers that slip between the cracks of parchment? The truth may be unknowable, and perhaps that's fitting. For a practice that blurred life and death, fact and folklore, it seems appropriate that historians still chase its meaning like shadows lengthening in the evening light. You drift now into the bright glow of modern media, where funeral weddings, long faded as real custom, are revived as spectacle. Movies, television dramas, even stage plays rediscover the eerie tension of a bride stepping forward while a coffin lies nearby. To audiences today, what once was practical looks exotic, taboo, even deliciously shocking. A mainstream historical fact. The 20th and 21st centuries turned many forgotten rituals into cultural touchstones through film and literature. Directors and playwrights have used the image of a wedding at a funeral as a shorthand for drama, contradiction, and Gothic flair. Though not literal history, the portrayal keeps the memory alive, ensuring that what was once necessity now survives as entertainment. Now for the quirky tidbit. In one mid-20th century British film, a scene shows mourners filing out of a church, only for a bridal procession to push past them, white gown brushing against black veils. The clash of colours on screen was so striking that critics called it a collision of moods in technicolor. It wasn't meant to be historically accurate, just symbolically irresistible. Historians still argue whether such depictions help illuminate forgotten practices or distort them into grotesque caricatures. Are filmmakers reviving genuine history or simply exploiting Gothic tropes for dramatic effect? Some scholars grumble about romantic misremembering, while others shrug, noting that stories always outlive the facts anyway. Picture yourself watching a modern stage production. On one side of the stage, pallbearers carry a coffin draped in black cloth. On the other, a bride enters, garlanded with flowers, her steps slow and hesitant. The lighting shifts, the music swells, and the audience gasps. They know they are seeing metaphor, not documentary, but the effect lingers all the same. In popular culture, the theme pops up everywhere from soap operas to Gothic novels. Sometimes it's played for comedy, a bungled scheduling mix-up that throws mourners and wedding guests together. Other times it's played for horror, with brides haunted by spirits because they wed too close to the dead. Either way, the motif refuses to vanish. You can almost laugh at how the old practicalities, saving money, gathering everyone at once, have been forgotten. Now the same ritual is remembered as something eerie and transgressive, a ready-made plot twist. A practice born of thrift has been reborn as drama, and perhaps that's fitting. Funeral weddings have always existed in the space between necessity and imagination. In today's media, they are less about historical accuracy and more about emotional resonance. They remind viewers that life and death, joy and grief are never far apart. As you lean back from the flickering screen in your imagination, you realize the custom may have faded in reality, but it thrives in stories. And maybe that's the truest afterlife any tradition can hope for, to live on not in parish registers, but in the images and emotions carried forward by each new generation. You arrive now at the quiet reflection, the place where all the strands you've followed, practical thrift, inheritance strategy, scandal, superstition, regional habit, and Gothic exaggeration, braid themselves into one truth. Humans have always tried to stitch beginnings onto endings. Weddings at funerals were not just curiosities. They were part of a timeless effort to make life feel whole, even when it wasn't. A mainstream historical fact. Anthropologists remind us that rituals of death and birth, of mourning and marriage, are rarely isolated. In many cultures, both are rites of passage, ceremonies marking transformation. Whether in medieval Europe, colonial America, or villages in Africa and Asia, communities often overlapped them because they carried the same weight, guiding souls from one state to another, binding individuals back into the community's fabric. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some 19th century folklorists noted that in remote places, villagers joked about being two birds with one priest. The saying summed it all up. Why waste effort when a single gathering could serve both God and the ledger? You can almost imagine a weary cleric muttering the phrase under his breath as he shuttled from coffin to couple. Historians still argue whether funeral weddings were commonplace or merely scattered exceptions. But, as you've seen, the debate itself reveals how messy human life is. The lines between necessity, symbolism, and scandal are blurred, and maybe they always were. So you picture, one last time, that long wooden table, bread is torn, cups are raised, tears and laughter mingle in the smoky air. The coffin lies nearby, the bride's veil flutters in the draught, and the community binds itself together in a single act that is at once unsettling and profoundly human. It is not disrespect, it is resilience, it is not madness, it is memory. And now, as your journey through this strange custom slows, your breathing softens. Let the images blur. The flicker of candles, the sound of fiddles, the rustle of veils and funeral cloth. See how joy and grief fold together until they no longer compete, only cradle one another. Let your mind rest in that balance, where sorrow is not erased, but gently held by hope, where endings lean into beginnings, and where even the strangest customs remind you that life continues always, even in the shadow of death. The hall grows quiet. The candles burn low, the echoes of laughter and sobbing fade into stillness. You are left with the calm knowledge that humanity has always found ways to endure, to connect, to turn loss into continuity. And now, so can you, drifting softly into sleep. And now, let everything slow. Let the story fade into a gentle hush, like the last notes of a lullaby lingering in the air. You've walked through centuries of weddings and funerals, through feasts and coffins, through laughter stitched to sorrow. You've seen how people, long before you, carried the same burdens of loss and the same longing for continuity. And just as they found ways to balance life and death, you too can rest in that balance tonight. Take a breath, deep and steady, and imagine the flickering of candles softening into darkness. Picture the hush of a churchyard at dusk, the grass cool beneath your feet, the sky stretching overhead in fading shades of violet and gold. No feasts, no voices now, only stillness. The graves lie quiet, the halls are empty, and the bride and groom have long since vanished into history. What remains is the calm rhythm of silence, the gentle truth that all things pass, and that passing itself can be soothing. Your thoughts can drift as freely as the smoke from a snuffed candle, rising, curling, dissolving into the night air. Nothing more is required of you. No ceremonies, no obligations, only the softness of rest. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the images blur, the words fade, and the weight of the day slide away. You are safe here, wrapped in calm. Life continues, grief softens, joy endures, and now your only task is to sleep sweet dreams.